I'm going to be talking about the research implementation gap and how conservation practitioners and researchers exchange information. And I apologize in advance if my voice shakes, if I can't finish my sentences properly, because this kind of presentation really makes me nervous. So, initially, the research project I had started to do was to build a socio-ecological model to measure the anthropogenic alley effect, like the hunting impact on the Tibetan antelope population. The French researcher I was supposed to work with specializes in this type of effect, which is, I don't know if you know it, basically the more it is hunted, the more consumers want the species, therefore the more it is hunted, until the time you reach the time where there is no more population and the price has increased. Back then, that sounded really applied to me, like, okay, I'm going to work on R, I'm going to be doing some modeling, and then we will see the best decisions that can be implemented during the conservation project. But then this is basically what happened. I asked what would be the outcomes in terms at the end of the project, like to really be implemented, and she was like, well, first I want you to get a paper published. Sure, that's fine, but like really in the field, what's going to happen? Well, I don't really have contacts over there. Really, no, I don't have much money. I don't have much time to work on that. So really, at the end of the building, like the model, if you have time left, you can try to see if there would be someone over there who could be interested in maybe using it. And that didn't make sense to me at all, which is how I started asking questions such as what information do practitioners use, what information do researchers use, and if they do exchange information, how do they do that? Which led me then to the GAP project. So I chose first to focus it on developing countries because as far as I had seen in the peer-reviewed literature, previous surveys had mainly been conducted in developed countries and even more the US, Great Britain, Australia. So I decided to focus on developing countries, especially because as well they may have more issues accessing the scientific information. I chose to focus on asking practitioners directly, which had already been done a bit, but I had seen mainly surveys asking researchers if they thought that their articles had been used, and clearly that may have led to overly optimistic results. And finally, I chose to focus as well on asking directly researchers from developing countries what type of sources, information they were using. That led me to an internet survey that ran from 23 to 33 questions, depending on how you answered. I translated it in English, French, and Spanish, and I sent it via three main mailing list. So the Conservation Leadership Program, the ORIX, which is the International Journal of Conservation. So basically, I emailed researchers who had published in ORIX and asked them if they knew practitioners who would have used the article, and then emailed all the practitioners I got the email of. And I did the same thing with the Conservation Science Group from Imperial College. I got a bit more than 200 people who started the questionnaire, but it was so long that actually I had 120 completed, which after a few removing of people who didn't basically were born in developed countries and then who had been working in developing countries. So that kind of made the thing false. I got my final sample of 99 respondents that I subdivided into 28 university researchers, who weirdly enough are individuals based in university and doing research. Then non-university researchers, people whose main occupation is research but who are doing it in NGOs, government, companies. And then 46 practitioners. So that kind of asked the question of what a practitioner is. And in the reviewed literature, it is mainly defined as what it's not. So he's not an academic. He's not a theoretician. He's not a researcher, and he's not a conservation biologist. That's what I've been reading. So I decided that he was, or she was, any decision maker whose main occupation is not research, but the actual implementation of conservation actions. So just to underline that as well about the sample, obviously I didn't reach all the practitioners everywhere. I reached practitioners, people who have internet access. I reached people who are able to talk French, English, or Spanish, and who had the knowledge of the gap, which means that for them, they rely on scientific information, because you may have people working in conservation and who don't rely on scientific information, therefore they don't have any knowledge of this gap. So a few results. First one is that open access literature is key. I asked them to rank the sources of scientific information they were using like their favorite, the least favorite. And clearly open access journals is the main one for everyone. Then you have databases, network, convention websites, like I can show you the list after if you're interested in that. And clearly university researchers rely more on peer-reviewed literatures than the others. And subscription-based journals comes like as a really low source for the two others, which is clearly linked to the price, but we'll talk more about the barriers with Jessica later on. And something that I noticed as well is that when I ask practitioners their favorite medium to actually communicate their own results. First came their institutional website, then personal emails, and then their institution newsletter, which are places where researchers don't go. So you can already see that one side of the research gap is appearing. The impact factor, we were talking about peer-reviewed literature a bit earlier, so it has a small impact. When I asked them if they were using it as a criteria of choice to access scientific information, 70% answered no. Then I asked, obviously, why, and it was an open question. And the main one which appeared was that they chose paper on their subject and relevance. That's for practitioners. The second thing that I found really interesting is that for university researchers, the second reason is that high impact factor journals are too disconnected from practice, which means that having a high impact is actually a reason, if you're really looking for practical information, to not choose a journal. And I even had like even more honest, let's say, researchers who clearly said, well, I look at impact factors when I am trying to get published, but when I look for information, no, I don't care about that. I also asked what would make peer-reviewed literature more useful for them. And I was clearly expecting to have the question of free access, the question of language, the question of, and language in different senses, like the language, French, English, whatever, but like scientific language, which is just so hard to get through so that you can get your information. But actually the thing they wanted the most was a website, a place where they could contribute to research design beforehand. So I guess that what practitioners, and you can tell me, yes, apparently there are a few of you in the room, want, it's not as much like scientific information pre-digested or even to be digested by them. It's contributing to the research beforehand to make sure that it answers the needs. So from there, I kind of modeled the situation. Researchers produce peer-reviewed literature, which is disseminated by journals, databases, books, which then goes back to researchers. We have a practitioner who do project reporting when they have time, and who disseminated them when they have time via the website, the newsletter, hard copy reports, whatever. But the thing is that we've seen it. Practitioners look for scientific information via journals, therefore they don't necessarily go to other institution websites. You don't have time for that. And that they don't go either to not that much open access journals. Well, no, not that much to scientific information the way it is distributed today. So subscription-based journal, it's not working, but clearly open access. So that led to actually, as far as I'm concerned, three main points, which is we need more open access sources. This is one of the key things. We need maybe a more systematic way to actually make practitioners' reports, I don't know how to call that. This is just like, information coming from your conservation project to make them more available for researchers, but for anyone, basically. And more than anything else, we need knowledge co-production, direct collaboration on-site, online, but the fact that practitioners and researchers can be on the same level and not something where you have a kind of hierarchical position, but like something on the same level where they can collaborate straight from the beginning of the research. So that's my conclusion, and I kind of have a chapter 3, which I like to call my naive vision of the gap history and of life in general. Just to open, this is not going to be a practical part of the presentation, just like to open and put things into perspective. As far as I'm concerned, once upon a time in humanity's life, there was no gap, because we all more or less had all the knowledge necessary to live in nature, to get our own food without destroying anything, and just to live without destroying everything. A few people still do live like that, a few tribes, few people who are trying to become autonomous even in developed countries. So it is feasible, there is still a path towards that somehow. But at one point, I think that this is something which happened, specialization, task divisions. We used to be hunters-gatherers, and then we started becoming fruit gatherers, medicinal plant gatherers, bird, mammoth hunters, whatever you want. And then it gets even, not worse necessarily, but advanced, let's say. We stopped gathering and we started producing to sell. So that's, again, a different approach to nature. We became fruit producers, and as there was this horizontal division, we also had this vertical division. Fruit producer project manager, director manager of the fruit producer, And as you have this blah, blah, blah coming up horizontally and vertically, you have this disconnection from nature, which increases, which is getting worse and worse. And this over-specialization is what led to the multiplication of gaps. And as far as I'm concerned, this research implementation gap is one aspect of the thousands of gaps we actually have to solve if we want to reach that one, the human society's nature gap. This is the real thing. So from a job perspective, I would say that the research implementation gap can be solved by, can be bridged by, more collaboration, open access, etc., etc. But at the end of the day, being a researcher, a practitioner, this is a job, which means that we get more or less money at the end of the month for doing that. But if at one point in our life we can't do that anymore, it doesn't make us less passionate about biodiversity conservation. Out there, outside of this conference, there are thousands of people who don't have the resume of a conservationist, but who are really doing their fair share of biodiversity protection because they think it's the right thing to do. So my point here, I think, is that there is kind of a danger of mixing human values with economic values. This is a job, this is great, but this is maybe not exactly the way forward to bridge the gap. And just one last thing to illustrate that, because he said it far better than I did. It's a quote from Bosingham. Do we really need to know the exact genetic relationship of that small plant on the top of the mountain, or should we just inform everyone that the ski resort will almost certainly destroy the population and the whole top of the mountain, by the way? Thank you.